afternoon is the question of whether local government or is local community planning in Virginia being influenced by international dogma and or directive. And I'm very pleased that Donna Holt is with us today. Donna has been quite active in the past 3 years relative to alerting citizens at all levels of government on the threat to private property rights and how so-called sustainable development is transforming society in a negative way, not in concert with code or the state constitution. Donna is going to take 45 minutes to, as she says, connect the dots that planners are missing, detailing the mostly hidden influence the UN has over local planning in Virginia. This is something that has been percolating and circulating across our state and parts of our nation, for that matter, relative to the question of whether or not local planning is truly local. Is it immune from a decree such as the UN and Agenda 21, etc.? So part of what she is prepared to do today is help us understand what those hidden dots are and how that local to local plan for sustainable development undermines the principles of federalism as well as our Constitution. Following Ms. Holt, Andrew McRoberts, who's an attorney with Sands Anderson here in Virginia. A little more about Andrew in a moment when he comes up. But Andrew will provide a similar discourse and process opine that the impact and directive relative to planning and zoning is purely that of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Ground rules, attention to Ms. Holt for 45 minutes. We will have an opportunity for questions advanced to her following the presentation by Andrew. So 45 with Donna, 45 with Andrew. We'll take a short break. We'll come back in, an opportunity for them to talk to each other in terms of sort of a rebuttal or reaction. Then I'll open it up to questions from the audience. And then we'll close out with 5-minute concluding remarks by Donna and by Mr. McRoberts. And it doesn't need to be said, but we will, as in any public forum and domain, be attentive and respectful throughout. The goal of this particular seminar is to provide information, perspective, and narrative that's central to how we manage growth and change at the local level. And I view it as an informative and important step in that direction. So, Donna, with that, welcome, and we look forward to your remarks.
And I want to thank you all for coming. And a special thank you to Mr. Chandler for providing me with this very, very good opportunity to share with you what I've learned over years of research about the United Nations Global to Local Action Plan for Sustainable Development called Agenda 21, and how sustainable development is transforming our community. First, I'd like to say that if you're looking for someone who is opposed to zoning and planning, you're not going to find one here. I absolutely do support zoning and planning, and I commend all of you. I know you work very hard, you have a lot of workshops to attend, a lot of information to absorb. I know that there are a lot of state and federal mandates that are placed upon you, and you have to figure out how to sort those out and how to abide by those through your planning for our local community. But what I want to share with you today is something that we don't hear about at the local level. In fact, we don't hear about it at any level of government, and it's largely hidden, and I'll reveal why that is so. But first, I'd like you to meet a few people. Let's begin with Betty Perry of Orem, Utah. You'll notice she has a wound on her nose. That happened when armed code enforcement officers took her down on her front steps and arrested her for not watering her lawn. Now, it wasn't that she didn't want to water the lawn, but she was on a fixed income. Everything had increased in price. Her cost of living had risen, and she simply couldn't afford to spend money for water to water the lawn. This is one of the minor cases. Meet Jacques and Marcel Dupuis of Llano, California. They lived out in the desert, where they built this beautiful little cottage. They thought this was where they would retire to. They got all the necessary building permits that complied with code, and they, of course, being in the desert, you can't exactly drill a well. There is no public water. So they were approved for a water tank. But when there was a code change that required a water treatment system, they simply couldn't afford it. So they weren't grandfathered in. The water tank was not grandfathered in, which is what one would expect. But they were forced to dismantle every board and nail of their home. In Dade County, Florida, 1,500 people are losing their homes and businesses because the EPA came in and told them they were residing on wetlands, even though the Army Corps of Engineers did a study and said it was no wetlands. And they are ongoing in court with their battle today. Then in King County, Washington, owners of 5 acres are losing the use of 65% of their land due to something called the 65-10 rule, where 65% of their land has to remain natural and undisturbed. It made front page news when they delivered 17,000 petition signatures to the county courthouse. And now for one a little closer to home. Greg Garrett of York County, Virginia. He's a real estate broker, and when real estate went soft, the market crashed, he decided he would supplement his income with an oyster farm and would sell oysters to the community and even exported oysters. He got all the necessary certifications, licenses and permits from the state to grow, harvest, sell, and even export his oysters. And as you'll notice, his land here is right there at the mouth of the York River, where it opens to the Chesapeake Bay. And he even leased the property for his oyster farm from the state. Now, his land is zoned agricultural. And according to the federal and state government, aquaculture is agriculture. But local code changed the definition, and aquaculture was no longer considered agriculture, so they ordered him to shut down, and they have a court case pending now. This is the kind of thing that we see happening all over America. Some of it very major, some of it not so much, some of it you all have absolutely no control over at the local level. It's the federal government. In fact, most of it you don't, because you take your direction from federal and state government. But this is the kind of thing we've seen happening. So it deserves a closer look. These issues need to be addressed. Because one thing for certain, property rights in America do matter. It was so important to the founders. They believed that the right to own and control property was essential to liberty and prosperity. And it was so important that they protected property rights in the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. But I can tell you, America is unique in this respect. Other nations absolutely do not believe as we do. In fact, there are many nations who will take your property, like Panama, for instance. The government can take your property without notice and without compensation. I want to first look at the origins of sustainable development. So we'll go back to June 1976 at the UN Conference on Human Settlements in Vancouver. They issued a 65-page Vancouver Declaration, and the section under land in the preamble is very telling. It says that land, because of its unique nature and the crucial role it plays in human settlements, cannot be treated as an ordinary asset, controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the market. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth, and therefore contributes to social injustice. If unchecked, it may become a major obstacle in the planning and implementation of development schemes. Social justice, urban renewal and development, The provision of decent dwellings and healthy conditions for the people can only be achieved if land is used in the interest of society as a whole. It goes on to say that excessive profits resulting from the increase in land value are one of the principal causes of the concentration of wealth in private lands. Therefore, government should recapture excessive profits due to increased land values to redistribute to the public at large. Public ownership of land should be exercised in favor of the common good, rather than to protect the interest of the already privileged. Attention should be paid to the separation of land ownership rights from development rights, the latter to be entrusted to a public authority. Now, all of this doesn't sound like anything we would hear about in America, but I assure you it's something that has been coming at us, and I'll explain how. Meet Gro Harlem Brundtland. She is a major player in the plan for sustainable development. She's the former Prime Minister of Norway, very popular lady. In fact, she was the minister 3 times in Norway. She's also the Vice President of the World Socialist Party and the Chairman of the Brundtland Commission. And we'll hear more about the Brundtland Commission. In fact, many federal agencies talk about the Brundtland Commission, particularly the EPA, in some of their documents. But what I found interesting also was that in the United States, there is a socialist party. Now, we all think of the Democratic and Republican parties, so I was amazed to hear that the Socialist Party is in the United States as well. And to understand the type of sustainable development that these people are talking about, you first must understand the way they think, the things they say, because that is reflected in the plans that they draft that essentially were adopted by the United States. On the World Socialist Party of the United States' own website, it says that the World Socialist Party of the United States is part of a global socialist movement that believes capitalism cannot meet the needs of the majority of the people in the world, however progressive it might become. To meet these needs, capitalism must be replaced by socialism. Well, that's fine. You know, I have nothing against socialism. If it's for them, let them take it. But that's not what the United States was founded on. And we were given inalienable rights. We weren't given inalienable rights. We have inalienable rights that are protected by the Constitution. But they don't think the way we do. The General Assembly for the United Nations asked the Brundtland Commission, of which Ms. Brundtland chaired, to take the principles of the Vancouver Declaration and develop a strategy for reducing poverty. And so at the 1987 UN Conference on Environment and Development, they released a plan known as Our Common Future. I have a copy of it here. You can purchase it online. Our Common Future describes sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Well, that sounds pretty good. In fact, I pretty much like that. Except when you read a little further into their report, you realize the meaning behind it for them. Another quote I found in the book is, "Poverty is a major cause and effect of global environmental problems." So now they're linking poverty and the environment. Now, in looking at earlier documents, I know that socialism is something that there were socialists trying to bring their ideology to our country. And then on the other side, we had environmentalists who wanted to preserve all of nature and rural land. But they were at odds with each other. And they absolutely did not work together. They were arch enemies. But after the Cold War, the socialists thought, well, you know what, maybe we should bring the environmentalists in. And here's where the link comes in with poverty and the environment. And they began to work with environmentalists and made environmentalism the excuse for bringing about their ideology in America. The book goes on to talk about the importance of creating equity or social equity, also known as social justice, through the proper balance of economy and environment. They also provide the data from the World Bank for the per capita of the GDP by groups of countries. And they go on to talk about the methods for reducing poverty, in which they say that you must take the wealth of the wealthier nations and transfer that to poorer nations. So this was their plan for reducing poverty. And they intended to use land use as a means of doing that. So they took these ideas to the 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, where they were also asked to develop a strategy for worldwide sustainable development by the year 2000 and beyond. And at this conference, there were 18,000 people in attendance, many from the United States. The then President George H.W. Bush was there, the future EPA administrator, other government dignitaries and department heads, as well as many leaders of environmental groups. Maurice Strong was the chairman of this conference. He was also the director of the UN Environment Program, the chairman of the World Wildlife Foundation, and a member of the Brundtland Commission that produced this report. He was a very interesting character. He became a billionaire very young in life. He made millions by his mid-20s. He was an oil tycoon. He even bought 200,000 acres of land in Colorado over the largest water aquifer in the United States, and made tremendous wealth over piping that water throughout the southwest of the United States, until the environmentalists kicked him out, which was kind of interesting, because just 3 years prior to that, he was the director of the UN Environment Program. But that wasn't the end of his shenanigans. Anyone here heard of the oil for food scandal? Well, it seems he was connected to that, and he was run out of Dodge. In fact, he fled the United States and Canada. He went to China to avoid prosecution. But in his opening speech at the conference, he said that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class, involving high meat intake, the use of fossil fuels, electrical appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable. He goes on to say in a subsequent interview during the conference that isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilization's collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? Pretty stunning comments, certainly not the way we think here in America. And so they presented or unveiled the global to local plan known as Agenda 21. Here it is. And the slide you see is the cover page on the United Nations website. And in their very first paragraph, they state that Agenda 21 is a comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the United Nations system, governments, and major groups in every area in which humans impact on the environment. Now, I don't know of too many ways that humans don't impact the environment. In many ways, we impact it in a positive way, and in some ways negative. However, this at least tells you how all-encompassing this action plan is. In its preamble, it says that we are confronted with the perpetuation of disparities between and within nations, a worsening of poverty, hunger, ill health, and illiteracy. However, integration of environment and development concerns and greater attention to them will lead to the fulfillment of basic needs. No nation can achieve this on its own, but together we can, in a global partnership for sustainable development. The developmental and environmental objectives of Agenda 21 will require a substantial flow of new and additional financial resources to developing countries. Excuse me, I'm getting a little dry. In its 40 chapters, Agenda 21 addresses virtually every aspect of human life. It particularly addresses a plan for the control of land use, housing, transportation, food production, consumption patterns, water, energy, education, the role of business and industry, and healthcare. 179 nations agreed to adopt Agenda 21, and President George H.W. Bush was a signatory for the United States. So they have a plan, but it's a soft law, so there's nothing binding, and they needed a way to make it reality. So they came up with a convention on biological diversity and a treaty, and they provided a report. Did I step on something that disconnected me? Here we go. They provided a report that they said was conceived as a practical tool for translating the principles of Agenda 21 into reality. That report was the Global Biodiversity Assessment. It's an 1,142-page document, and I haven't read all of it, but what I do know about it, and what I have read, are what they say are the unsustainable human activities. Any skiers here? Because on page 337, they say that ski slopes are unsustainable. Backyard garden ponds are unsustainable. Pastures for grazing cattle is unsustainable. Golf courses are unsustainable. Highways and transportation by car is unsustainable. Dams are unsustainable. Our system of justice is unsustainable. Consumerism is unsustainable. They say that even the family is unsustainable, that we need to reduce the population to 1 billion, and currently we're at 7 billion. So it's interesting to know how they plan to do that. Single-family homes are unsustainable. And they go on to page 993, where they reveal a plan for what they call the Wildlands Project and its counterpart, Smart Growth. Now, under this project, they call for 50% of the American landscape to be rewilded or remain natural, to provide wildlife corridors and reserves. The areas you see in yellow would serve as buffer zones, where there would be very highly regulated use, limited use, something like some farming, some recreation, but very restricted, limited use. And the areas you see in green would serve as those areas for normal use. That's where we would live. Ideally, they would like us to live in high-density urban transit villages, where we use primarily public transportation rather than driving cars. Now, when this map was presented on the U.S. Senate floor in 1994 by Dr. Michael Kaufman, who is also a former congressman, the U.S. Senate voted not to ratify the treaty. It was tabled and never even voted on. Now, sustainable development is illustrated to depict the proper balance between equity, economy, and environment. They say to achieve equity, the individual must give up personal wants for the needs of the collective. Economic policy calls for the international transfer of wealth, and free markets are replaced with public-private partnerships. And individual rights are subordinate to environmental needs. So we'll examine that a little more closely. To achieve social equity, or what they call social justice, they'll use law to restructure human nature. Again, so that individual wants will have to give way to the needs of the collective. Meet Harvey Rubin. He was a member of the ICLEI Executive Committee, and we'll hear more about ICLEI in a moment. He was the clerk of the courts of Miami-Dade County. Remember the 1,500 residents who are losing their property in Dade County? You think they'll get very far with the lawsuit? He was the chair of the Climate Change Advisory Task Force And he was the keynote speaker for the Rio 10 Summit. The Rio 10 Summit was the 10th anniversary of Agenda 21. In his speech, he said, "The American system of justice may be changed to conform to that of the rest of the world, must be changed to conform to the rest of the world, and there must be a shift in attitudes. Individual wants, needs, and desires are to be conformed to the views and dictates of government planners. In the process of implementing sustainable development, individual rights will have to take a back seat to the collective." Now, who says stuff like that in America? But he's an American now. Now we're not talking about the socialists from the United Nations. This is an American. Their economic policy, again, calls for the transfer of wealth that comes from the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, Article 8, where they state that equity will be achieved through the transfer of resources to developing countries. And they advocate public-private partnerships. In fact, they believe that all business should be through public-private partnership. The problem with doing that is, as I'm sure you all know, a public-private partnership is when there is a unique arrangement between a private business and government. They have this mutual arrangement. The company is awarded tax breaks. The government shares in the liability. They have easy access to federal funding, and many times it creates monopolies. They almost always receive government subsidies, and they get very large government contracts. They make a lot of money through public-private partnerships. The problem is that when we have too many of those, free enterprise begins to topple. They have to assume all the tax liability. They have to assume all other liability. They have very limited access to federal funding. They have to compete with monopolies, which kind of leaves them out of the game. They don't receive subsidies, so the cost of doing business is much greater, and they struggle to survive. Their environmental policies place nature above man, where individual rights are subordinate to the environment. They take from Principle 1 of the Rio Declaration that human beings are at the center of concerns for sustainable development. They are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. They are entitled to a healthy and productive life. When someone entitles you to something, they can take it away. I entitle myself to a healthy and productive life, thank you. And this says that the only way I'm entitled to it is if I'm in harmony with nature. I'm sorry, I take exception with that. But to achieve a sustainable development, states should reduce and eliminate sustainable patterns of production and consumption. Well, that sounds pretty good, but remember all those things they said were unsustainable? On June the 14th, 1993, the White House issued a press release announcing the President's Council on Sustainable Development. And in this press release, they outlined the primary goals. And the very first one here is to respond to the recommendations in Agenda 21, the comprehensive international policy declaration nations of the world agreed to as a pledge to global environmental action, and contribute to the U.S. plan to be submitted to the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development, the international commission created at the Earth Summit to help ensure implementation of Agenda 21. 15 days later, President Bill Clinton issued Executive Order 12852, which created the President's Council on Sustainable Development. Now, the Council was responsible for taking the policy recommendations set forth in Agenda 21 and translating them into policy to be administered by federal agencies of the government and what is called the Sustainable America, a New Consensus. I have a copy of it here. The United Nations was delighted about this, and they even reported it on their website. Created by a 1993 executive order, the President's Council on Sustainable Development is explicitly charged with recommending a national action plan for Sustainable Development to the President. The PCSD submitted its report, Sustainable America, A New Consensus, to the President in early 1996. In the absence of the multi-sectoral consensus on how to achieve sustainable development in the United States, the PCSD was conceived to formulate recommendations for the implementation of Agenda 21. So now we brought it to the United States. We didn't ratify the treaty. It was a soft law. So now we've decided that we'll use an executive order and use rulemaking authority through federal agencies to implement the actions. So why haven't you heard about it? Why is it that every local government is in the dark? All of the planners are in the dark. I was in the dark about this until a few years ago. Well, this gentleman explains a little bit of that. His name is J. Gary Lawrence. He was an advisor to the President's Council on Sustainable Development. He helped draft the Millennium Papers. And in those papers, he states, participating in a UN-advocated planning process would very likely bring out men who would actively work to defeat any elected official undertaking local Agenda 21. So we will call our process something else, such as comprehensive planning, growth management, or smart growth. And here's how they're doing it. They dangle grants at very needy local governments with strings attached. And though there were 12 cabinet agencies who were members of the PCSD, at least these 6 provide the local grants that are driving this, and without your being aware. In fact, the Department of Transportation refuses to even give you money unless you go along with the Sustainable Communities Program. The EPA, they show their commitment to Agenda 21 in the Federal Register, Volume 63, number 163, on page 45,157. They say that the Sustainable Development Challenge Grant Program is also a step in implementing Agenda 21, the Global Action Plan on Sustainable Development, signed by the United States at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. How many of you have heard of the Sustainable Development Challenge Grant? Anyone here? It's been provided at the local level. They also reported again on January 3rd, 2012, where they state that the EPA's path forward, now this is a new program, their path forward, has begun to address this need for systematic incorporation by realigning EPA's entire research enterprise around the concept of sustainability. This has required agency scientists and managers to recognize the widely used definition of sustainability outlined by that Brundtland Commission in 1987, meeting the needs of the current generation while preserving the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. To fully embrace this definition, the 3 commonly recognized pillars of sustainability, here we go, economy, environment, and they're saying society, social equity, society, social justice, have been systematically integrated into EPA's research portfolio. The American Planning Association received $500 million to provide the Growing Smart Legislative Guidebook. Now they're a leading organizational member of the Planners Network. And in the statement of principles on their website, they say that we believe that planning should be a tool for allocating resources and developing the environment to eliminate the great inequalities of wealth and power in our society. We believe that planning should be used to assure adequate food, clothing, housing, medical care, jobs, safe working conditions, and a healthful environment. We advocate public responsibility for meeting these needs because the private market has proven incapable of doing so. Well, excuse me, but the last time I checked, I could go to a private market and buy my food or clothing or housing. I could get medical care, and they provided jobs. And of course, we have rules and regulations that provide safe working conditions and a healthful environment. The APA also adopted something called the precautionary principle. Now, this principle has also been adopted by every federal agencies of the government, and in fact, you see it in a lot of plans. It essentially says that where threats of serious or irreversible damage to meat or to people or nature exist, anticipatory action will be taken to prevent damage to human and environmental health, even when full scientific certainty about cause and effect is not available, with the intent of saving the quality of life for current and future generations. This is from the Rio Declaration, Principle 15 and Agenda 21, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. Saying pretty much the same thing. So this again goes back to the precautionary principle use. So even if they think, like those 1,500 people in Dade County, even if they think it's a wetlands, they don't have to prove it's a wetlands. If they think it is, the precautionary approach should be taken. The American Planning Association also advocates something that I find the most disturbing. And there are a lot of things I could pick on with the American, but this is the most disturbing. There's something called the amortization of non-conforming uses. Now, but why be concerned about that, right? We have a constitution that protects our property rights. But for homeowners in a community that adopts the guidebook's vision, the APA amortization proposal means that the extinguishing over time of your right to occupy their houses and without just compensation for loss of that property, how long they have before they must forfeit their homes would be completely up to the local government. Now, this is in Chapter 8 from the Growing Smart Legislative Guidebook. I do have the 2-volume set. I didn't bring it. It weighs about 12 pounds. It's 1,500 pages. This is the cover page. But in Chapter 8, it says specifically, a local government's zoning ordinance may state a period of time after which non-conforming land uses, structures, or signs, or designated classes of non-conforming land uses, structures, and/or signs must terminate. I find that very alarming. And they themselves concede that this could pose a constitutional challenge. Other ways that Agenda 21 is being promoted and legislated in the United States is through UN-sanctioned NGOs, mostly environmental and wildlife groups. And while they do a lot of wonderful things, they're also pushing this agenda. And they spend many, many millions of dollars lobbying Congress and legislatures, and as well as local governments, because they see this whole thing as the best chance they've got of protecting the environment. And I'm not suggesting that I don't support protection of the environment. I don't support environmental extremism. Here's another NGO that's very helpful in implementing Agenda 21, ICLEI. They are actually the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. That's where the letters ICLEI come from. Today they call themselves Local Governments for Sustainability. And they have the task of mobilizing and technically supporting local Agenda 21 worldwide. And they say so in their own publication of the local planning guide, local Agenda 21 planning guide. And it was published by them. Their name is on it, on the bottom. But they now, since so many people are waking up and talking about it across the country, they tried to scrub their website of Agenda 21. I can still find it on there, but they tried to scrub the website, and they totally deny any connection to the United Nations and Agenda 21. And you don't just pay dues, membership dues. In fact, it's local governments who are members of ICLEI. And in Virginia, we have 14 of them. There used to be 18. But 4 of them voted to discontinue their membership once they realized what was really going on. But you don't just pay dues. You have to also agree to a resolution pledging to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And they have a 5-milestone process. This describes that process. Education is another way of implementing sustainable development policies. And at the 2003 International Conference on Education for a Sustainable Future, 2005 through 2014 was declared the decade for education for sustainable development. UNESCO was named the leader in this effort. UNESCO said at the conference that the decade of ESD is a far-reaching and complex undertaking that potentially touches on every aspect of life. The basic vision is a world where everyone learns the values, behavior, and lifestyles required for a sustainable future and for positive societal transformation. So they're agreeing that this is good, and it affects every aspect of life. But it didn't stop there. Through No Child Left Behind, they extended it to K through 12 public schools. In Virginia, we call it Greening Virginia's K through 12 schools, and they have ongoing case studies and surveys to track the progress of sustainable development in the curriculum. And essentially what it is teaching them social justice principles. So the Convention on Biodiversity, you know, that treaty that was never ratified, well, things weren't going quite well as they would like. With Rio Plus 20, the 20th anniversary of Agenda 21 coming up, and the conference that's about to occur, a lot of pressure has been put on President Obama. And in June of last year, he issued Executive Order 13575, which created the White House Rural Council, and it essentially gave him authority over all food, fiber, and energy in the United States. And I keep stepping on this cord, don't I? And of course, the problem with this is that it's not happening primarily through legislation. It's happening through federal agencies, agencies of the federal government, using rulemaking authority. And in March of this year, for the counterpart, Smart Growth, Obama issued Executive Order 13602, creating the White House Council on Strong Cities and Strong Communities. In 1994, the Virginia General Assembly created a task force to study Sustainable Development, Agenda 21. And in 1997, they issued to the Governor and the General Assembly their report, House Document Number 6, that outlined the concept of sustainable development, Agenda 21 origins and policies, the current sustainable development initiatives, sustainable development projects in Virginia, and a strategic plan for Virginia. And of course, what we're seeing is some of the framework now in many of the laws that are being passed through our General Assembly that really contribute themselves to the Wildlands Project. I've outlined just a few urban development areas, which I'm very proud to say is now, after this past session, optional rather than mandatory. The Open Space Easement Act, the Conservation Easement Act, the Purchase and Transfer of Development Rights, and wetlands and wetlands mitigation banking. We even have a Virginia Wildlife Action Plan, which is okay by me, except that it says that programs that provide technical and financial assistance for habitat conservation and restoration on private lands are vital to sustaining Virginia's rich and diverse wildlife resources. Well, I find that a little disturbing. We can have habitat conservation on public land, but on private land? What does that mean, and who makes that decision? And let me also say that there are many other pieces of legislation contributing to this. I just highlighted the most important ones. But now let's look at what happens at the local level, where you have an opportunity to do the planning. But you've got all of these regulations happening that you have to consider when you're drafting the planning for the local community. And so I'll set up a scenario for you. Grandpa Jones has a 1,600-acre farm that's been in the family for 3 generations. The Jones kids are all grown now, and they've left the community. So Grandpa Jones decides to sell the family farm to retire. XYZ developers offer $1.6 million for the property, and they've got a great plan. They want to rezone 1,400 acres to residential. They'll rezone 200 acres to commercial. They'll set aside 100 acres of the residential property for a future school. They'll hold it up to 10 years and sell it to the school board for the same thing they paid for it originally. They'll build 3,250 new homes, and they'll build a 200-acre shopping center. They'll bring new jobs to the community. There's more than enough revenue coming in to cover all the infrastructure needed for the development. Sounds like a win-win for everybody. Except the comprehensive plan says that the Jones farm is outside of the urban boundary. Utilities cannot be extended. 20% is dedicated to the county for public use. 500 acres is a protected area. Open space provision allows only one structure per 40 acres on the remaining land, so only 28 homes can be built. Well, that's not a very good deal. So XYZ developers abandon the project. There's lost revenue for the county, no new jobs, no retirement for Grandpa Jones. The land is stripped of its value, and the county owes Grandpa Jones nothing. Folks, this is equivalent to social engineering. And that's how they propose to do what is done. So, and what happens is it forces all future growth, even though it's not mandated by any legislation. This type of social engineering drives all future growth to high-density communities, and the result is this: the biodiversity plan that was never ratified by Congress. And what is the remedy? Well, first, you can avoid accepting grants with sustainability strings attached, but most importantly, use coordination. Congress specifically set forth criteria as to the duties an agency must carry out under coordination. Federal agencies are required by federal statute to coordinate with local governments. And we have an expert here among us. I'd like to introduce you to Joe Garino. Joe, will you stand up, please? Joe is an expert on coordination. Now, coordination is used by federal government to push all these things on us. But we can also invoke coordination to push back at the overregulation by federal government, and as well as state government. Am I correct about that? State government as well?
Yes.
So if you're interested in knowing more, see Joe at the end of the program, or you can contact me. My contact information is on the back of the handout, what is sustainable development, and I'll be glad to put you in touch with them. So now we must decide the direction for the future. Will we choose the vision for sustainable development or the vision of the founders? You have a right to own property, or you become property. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna and Andrew McRoberts. As part of that introduction, I should have shared with you that she volunteers and is functioning as, I guess, the executive director now?
I'm actually the president and executive director,
Virginia.
but I don't make any money doing this, folks. I'm a volunteer.
Emphasis on volunteers. Very good. Well, thank you very much. Andrew will come up and provide his comments relative to what he believes are the links that guide comprehensive community planning at the local level. Then we'll take a break following Andrew's remarks, and then come back in and have some exchange. Good. Andrew is an attorney with St. Anderson, which is a law firm located in Richmond, offices elsewhere. He's in the local government section, practices local government law primarily, statewide in terms of his local government practice, frequent speaker at conferences, published author, and has defended local government in land use cases and other forums. Experience has been in the public sector, various stops along the way, Arlington, Culpeper, Richmond, bachelor's from William & Mary, and his law degree from the University of Richmond, and he was there along with you. So Andrew, once he is wired up, will be presenting his, there you go.
I'm wired, Mike.
Material is in your handout. Yes.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me here today, and thanks also to Donna Holt and the folks who came with her for coming and explaining to us what the UN Agenda 21 is about. I'm taking a little bit of a different approach, and that is to go back to what I see the historical, philosophical, and legal precedents that led to what we know today as modern planning and zoning. And then I'll sort of tie it around at the end back to some of the information on Agenda 21. My presentation is entitled The Early History of Virginia Planning and Zoning, Locke versus Hobbes, and Where Planning and Zoning Really Comes From. I'm going to talk about these competing zoning themes. We're going to talk a little bit about collective liberty versus individual liberties. I think Donna touched on that a little bit earlier in her comments. I'm going to introduce you to Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, if you don't know them. We're going to talk about police powers and constitutional checks on government. And we're going to talk about examples of early land use and sustainability regulation in America and in Virginia before the zoning term was even used, let alone the sustainability term. Talking about competing planning themes. Many of y'all are elected officials or planning officials, planning staff in communities, and we've all been there. You're in a public hearing. There is a contentious matter at issue. There are two sides at the table or at the dais. One comes in and says, why can't the government stop my neighbor from doing that thing that I don't like? It's going to hurt my family, it's going to hurt my property value, it's going to ruin my well, it's going to cause too much traffic on the roads. We've all been there, right? I know I have been. I was a county attorney for 13 years and I saw it a lot, okay? So that one, obviously, I think all those people may have legitimately felt that, but I'm calling that the NIMBY crowd, just for ease of reference, okay? The second competing planning theme is, and this is, I think, where Ms. Holt comes from, what gives the government the right to tell me what I can and cannot do with my property? That's a legitimate perspective. Hey, it's mine, right? I own it. I've got the deed. What does the government have to get off telling me what I can do with my property? Well, you can see the conflict between those two perspectives. One is a private citizen with rights, with property, who says, you are affecting my property. I don't like it. And the other says, well, but it is my property. It's being affected. Why can't I do what I want with the property, even if it affects you? Well, there's a balance there, and that's what we're going to be talking a little bit in my presentation. And both of those themes are perhaps best reflected early on in the political philosophy of my good friends Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke were political philosophers. The English Revolution, 1642 through 88, was a nasty time in England. People were beheading each other. There were monarchs being replaced. There was a whole lot of stuff going on. It was a very violent and difficult time. Whether you were in the government, out of the government, for the government, or against the government, it was a bad time. These folks really stood out as philosophers at that time to try to explain, okay, how should government work? And they really gave a lot of thought, and they wrote extensively about how government ought to work. And even though they ended up completely polar opposites in their conclusion, Their approach was very much the same. Previously, during medieval days and earlier, kings would say, well, I have divine right. God appointed me to rule over you, and that's all the explanation you need. Thank you very much. Well, these gentlemen, that wasn't good enough for them. They said, well, we really have to have a better explanation than that for our government. We have to understand why is it the government has the power to do what they do and why. Hobbes, obviously he's written a lot. I'm going to boil it down to a slide or two, okay? He believed that people were nasty, brutish, greedy, that they were really out for themselves, and because they were out for themselves, they would end up hurting other people around them. He said that citizens should demand order from their government. They should be willing to cede all of their rights in order to gain safety. Now, you understand that may seem extreme today, but I will tell you, coming out of the brutality of the English Civil War, he truly did believe that. They should cede all of their rights in order to obtain safety, health, and community values. Sounds a little bit like Agenda 21, doesn't it? Now, government provides order, he said, to secure safety. The people owe their security or their safety to the government, which has the power necessary to do so. He viewed that individuals alone did not have the power to protect themselves against themselves. Okay, so he believed that government should be a group, a body of people that have been ceded rights by the people in order to protect the people. And so he essentially, just to sum it up in one statement, he believed really in collective liberties. That if we join in together and we all contribute our rights in together to the collective government, then the government will protect us, and basically there is no I in team. Go team. Okay. Locke, on the other hand, he's going to sound a little more familiar to you as Americans, because a lot of what his political philosophy went into the English Bill of Rights. It influenced Thomas Jefferson. It influenced our Declaration of Independence, and yes, our Fifth Amendment and other parts of our Constitution. He was a great defender of the rights of the individual. In his view, if individuals were set free, then they would take care of it, okay? That we really didn't need to have these communal goals, because individuals, if they were set free and they were given liberty, then they would make a good community. He believed that government is only legitimate if it receives consent of the governed through a social contract and protects the natural rights of, sound familiar, life, liberty, and property. That's Locke. Government was granted power by the people who, by nature, have rights and power. Like Ms. Holt said earlier, by nature, we have power and rights. And so for Locke, it was individual liberties, or essentially me and my property come first. That was Locke. Okay, so what does it matter? That was a long time ago, Andrew. What are you talking about? Okay, that was in the 17th century, and I heard a little bit about it going in our Constitution, but what is Hobbes about? Hobbes was really the origin of state police power, of the central government looking out for the people by consent. The government acts to protect the health, safety, welfare, stop nuisances, and to protect people from themselves, essentially. This was the origin of state police power. And yes, the father of NIMBY, the power of that person who you don't like who lives next to you to tell you what you can do. Planning, zoning, all those environmental regulations that the EPA comes about, that Ms. Holt was talking about. This is right out of Hobbes' book, okay? And that is because the government is about protecting the communal interests of people. And yes, there are times when individual rights have to take a back seat in order to protect that. That's Hobbes' political philosophy. Locke is, of course, the origins of all those marvelous constitutional principles. No takings, individual liberties, due process, and yes, big influence on Jefferson. And yes, he's the father of leave me and my property alone. Okay. Historically speaking, planning and zoning developed over the years from this concept that the community, the government, can protect people from nuisances by legislation. Judge Blackstone, who is an English jurist who I know in law school, I read his dictionary. Nuisance is fine, anything that unlawfully worketh hurt, inconvenience, or damage. And police powers allow the government to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the citizenry. And the legacy is that planning and zoning is what? It's police power. It's an exercise of the police power by the government to protect the health, safety, welfare of the community, of the citizens. And so Hobbes it really leads directly to planning and zoning, and use of the police power. Among things that is the legacy of Hobbs in our planning and zoning today, highest and best use of a limited commodity. Like, for example, how much density should be permitted? Should we allow 2,700 units on that nice farm that Ms. Holt showed you? Or perhaps is 27 a better number? I don't know the right number. I don't think Ms. Holt knows the right number. But should that individual farm owner control that density, or should that be a community decision? And that's really the political philosophy that underlies all of this. Protection of the environment and resources. Are there sensitive areas? Are there things of public value? Are there things, for example, such as the wetlands that Ms. Holt talked about, other watersheds that go into our drinking water? Are those things worthy of protection as a government, as a community? Or should we leave those things to be affected only by individual action? In other words, if an individual in the watershed thinks he ought to do what he wants to do with that land, should he be allowed to? Well, you know, Hobbes would say no. Locke would probably say sure, because he's not brutish and greedy. He's actually going to act in his interest, and that ultimately is going to protect the public. And then, of course, wise use of public resources. There's only so many dollars. There's only so many pavement miles we can build. There's only so many spots in the schools that we can afford to have. So how do we manage our growth and development in a way that's sustainable? And yes, that's a good term, because it's affordable and that it actually works, because we otherwise cannot afford what we would be doing otherwise. So the legacy of Locke, individual liberties and regulations, and this is where there's that check, because certainly the community, if taken at and given unlimited power, could in fact trump on individuals' rights in a way that would be politically unsupportable, and certainly would not be appropriate in our country, in our state, or in our local governments. So Locke does put limits. The legacy of Locke puts limits, constitutional limits. There's substantive due process requirements. You got to be reasonable. There's procedural due process. You got to follow the rules. The General Assembly, believe you me, goes and looks at those rules every year and adjusts them. Equal protection. You got to treat similarly situated landers the same. In other words, we can't treat one property owner in that watershed differently than we do another property owner in that watershed, if we're going to affect them equally. And there are other checks. The Dillon Rule, which I don't have time to go into, but it essentially says that the General Assembly can tell local governments whatever they want, and local governments have to do it. Notice requirements or public hearing requirements. There's public participation requirements, advertisement, public process. There are statutory provisions for challenges to government actions. There's the Freedom of Information Act. There's the Conflicts of Interest Act. All those are checks on government power and require accessibility. So let's go back to the early history of zoning. I told you about Locke and Hobbes, and that was about the 17th century. Now fast forward by just a little. We're in Jamestown, 1607. Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in America. But in many respects, it was a planned community. It wasn't a bunch of individuals that showed up and each individually said, hey, let's make a triangular fort. That was a decision made by the company, made by folks on behalf of the group. They had a new town, they had new buildings, they had planning concerns. Some of the planning concerns included security. When you show up and there are a bunch of scary Indians around shooting at you, security is very important. They essentially were a police state for a good long time because of that. Access and internal movement. How do we get around without getting shot at? Use and preservation of natural resources. As you know, if you've ever been down there or studied the history of Jamestown, drinking water was a notorious problem. Well after well failed or went bad because they were digging into bad aquifers and they were down there in the swamp. Procurement, storage of drinking water, collection and disposal of wastes. They did not understand, as we do, what happens when bugs and waste and water all interact. And so they had serious problems. But they did do what they could. What they understood, they did. They adopted rules on, yes, sustainable distances between residential areas within the fort and the needed processing and manufacturing facilities, separating them by a required amount. There had to be a certain distance required and strictly enforced between wells and privies. And this is really true across colonial America. British colonists in many colonies enacted local regulatory ordinances banning things from like slaughterhouses from communities, putting gunpowder mills outside of town in case they blowed up, they wouldn't hurt anybody, and basically banished them to the outskirts of the town. The idea was no pigs in the parliament. 1,000 Colonial Williamsburg. We're very proud in Virginia to have Colonial Williamsburg and have it restored there, but it allows you to see what a planned community of the 18th century looked like. At Middle Plantation, it already existed. They came in and designed a town. They had a central street. They renamed it Duke of Gloucester Street. They had a couple of other parallel streets. They located major public uses, the Capitol, the jail, the Governor's Palace, the courthouse, the Powder Magazine, the church, William and Mary, my alma mater. And in fact, two ports, one that went onto a creek down to the James River and one went to a creek that went down to the York River. And they established the street grid. They established minimum dwelling house sizes. They established setbacks. They even established the degree of roof pitch. And so if you go down there and you think it's so lovely, it's because there were rules that made it look that way. As a matter of fact, the maximum setbacks were uniform on Duke of Gloucester Street, but then when you get to some of the back streets, it varied. And in fact, there was a group of people, they were appointed as, quote, directors, who could actually vary the setback on those back streets, a little like a local planning commission, or a little like a local council or board of supervisors. Y'all are familiar with this layout of the town, but that's the old Frenchman's map. During the Battle of Yorktown, Frenchmen drew up this map, and it shows a little bit of what it looked like, and this was used in the restoration. Later on, another safety issue, fire districts. As density became greater in our cities and wooden structures began to catch fire, they began to regulate wooden buildings for fire concern. Things like setbacks, things like construction. And there's a series of local land use controls there on the screen. All of those nuisance regulations, as they might have been considered at that time, were in question legally until the United States Supreme Court decided in 1887 in Mugler versus Kansas that, quote, all property in this country is held under the implied obligation that the owner's use of it shall not be injurious to the community. That's how the Supreme Court came down. It said private property owners, yes, you have rights. Yes, the government can't take away your property without due process and without just compensation, but we draw the line at you injuring the rest of the community. And that's where the Supreme Court laid it down, and frankly, that's where it is largely today. Private property rights are subject to the needs of the community and balance. A few other things. Height became an issue. Otis invented the elevator, and all of a sudden you could build really tall buildings. And the problem with tall buildings is, well, now you're blocking the sun, now you're blocking my light. Now you're having such an immense thing, I'm afraid it's going to fall on me. And so really they started having all these height limitations. By 1913 in Manhattan, there were more than 50 buildings with more than 20 stories. The tallest building in the city of Richmond, for example, is about 24 stories, to give you an idea. The Aquila building was in Broadway was 38 stories tall. And if you look at the newspaper reports of the day, they were very concerned about this shadow that it cast over 7 acres. And so in 1916, New York City adopted the first comprehensive zoning ordinance in the U.S., and they only had 3 zoning districts. Can you imagine New York City only had 3 zoning districts? Residential, business, and whatever. The unrestricted zone. And that's it. And believe it or not, it was much amended over the years, but it in fact remained in effect until 1961. True story. And there's the land use map from 1916. All right. That obviously got a lot of attention, and folks that thought that was a good idea decided to let's keep the momentum going. Then Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover, who was later U.S. President, he decided that he wanted to create an advisory committee as Commerce Secretary to draft model building codes and to draft model state planning and zoning enabling acts. In other words, let's take a look at what New York did, let's tweak it a little bit, let's come up with a model that can be adopted in various states and various local governments. And there he is, tipping his hat to you. Here's a quote. Planning was one of Hoover's early interests. He wrote early in his administration as president, the enormous losses in human happiness and in money which have resulted from lack of city plans which take into account the conditions of modern life need little proof. The lack of adequate open spaces, of playgrounds and parks, the congestion of streets, the misery of tenement life and its repercussions upon each new generation are an untold charge against our American life. Our cities do not produce their full contribution to the sinews of American life and national character. The moral and social issues can only be solved by a new conception of city building, said Hoover. The Standard State Zoning Enabling Act was promulgated for states to adopt and delegate powers to local governments. It established procedures for amendments to zoning, special exceptions, variances. It created the Board of Zoning Appeals for the first time. And it even had some, at the time, enigmatic language that people weren't exactly sure what it means. It has to be, quote, in accordance with a comprehensive plan. And there was a Standard City Planning Enabling Act, which you would call model ordinance for localities to adopt. And it had a municipal planning commission, very first planning commission, authorized preparation of a master plan, required review of public improvements by the planning commission. That's the 2232, as we call it in Virginia, or the consistency with the comprehensive plan review that planning commissions do today. It authorized subdivision regulation. It authorized the preparation of the official map, and it created regional planning commissions. And in fact, most states authorize zoning using those standard acts, certainly in the East and in places where there was more urban, and certainly Virginia very quickly did. February 7, 1922, the General Assembly approved their very first act authorizing councils to divide their cities into districts or zones, establish setback building lines, and compel the property owners to conform thereto. And the act actually read as follows, and I think it's very interesting because I certainly was very interested to hear what Ms. Holt said about concerns with Agenda 21. Let's look into the 1922 Virginia Act for evidence of UN influence. Quote, that for the promotion of the health, safety, morals, comfort, prosperity, and general welfare of the public, the council or any other governing body of any city may by ordinance divide the area of the city into one or more districts of the shape and area as may be best suited to carry out the purposes of this act. And in those districts may establish setbacks. They may regulate and restrict the location of the buildings and structures, their height and bulk, the percentage of lot to be occupied by buildings, the size of courts and other open spaces, the trade, industry, residence, and yes, the specific uses of the premises to be done, provided that nothing may impair a vested right. Okay? That was the very first act. And it wasn't long before the challenges to zoning occurred. In the federal level, the Village of Euclid, Ohio versus Ambler Realty in 1926, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of zoning. The Virginia Supreme Court did the same thing the same year. And they said in Gorey versus Fox, the quote, legislature may, in the exercise of the police power, restrict personal and property rights in the interest of public health, public safety, and for promotion of general welfare. Sort of a la Hobbes, eh? Just exactly what he said. And after the royal governor, we are up to 1926. Let's go back to the colonial days. This is my segment on how zoning is really authorized. In the colonial days, we were obviously governed by the Royal Council, the House of Burgesses, and essentially a royal charter. After the governor dissolved the House of Burgesses in 1774, Virginia's revolutionary leaders met in colonial Williamsburg and decided they would govern via Virginia conventions, which were representatives of the people, very similar to the House of Burgesses, but in this case a convention directly representing the will of the people. And in 1776, the fifth such convention declared that the Commonwealth's independence from the British Empire, authorized their delegation in Philadelphia to propose independence, which they did, and adopted George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights and also the very first Virginia Constitution, which governs us today as amended. Today, the Virginia Constitution says that, quote, all legislative powers in the Commonwealth of Virginia are, quote, vested in a General Assembly, Article 4, Section 1. And then it says in Article 7, Section 2, the, quote, General Assembly shall provide by general law for the organization, government powers of counties, cities, and towns. Ladies and gentlemen of local government, that's where you get it, right there. And it's really up to the General Assembly. And all power of the Commonwealth and that's delegated to the political subdivisions really comes from the General Assembly. The U.S. Constitution, 10th Amendment, favorite amendments, says the powers not delegated to the United States by Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states or to the people. And in Virginia, we've got a marvelous case. 2010, FFW Enterprises versus Fairfax. Quote, in contrast to the federal Constitution, the Constitution of Virginia is not a grant of legislative power to the General Assembly, but it's a restraining document, and except as matters that have been ceded to the federal government, the legislative powers of the General Assembly are without limit. So, local government officials, staff, if you don't like the rules on planning and zoning in Virginia, blame the General Assembly because they write them. So let's talk a little bit about what the General Assembly has authorized. Virginia Code Title 15.2, Chapter 22, Article 7, it talks about zoning. And it's really been adopted by the General Assembly in various forms over the years and much amended ever since 1922. The locality's authority to regulate or prohibit otherwise lawful land uses under zoning is in 15.2-2280. That's the section that says, yes, you can have a zoning ordinance. It says any locality may by ordinance classify the territory, have the number, shape, and size of the districts, and in each district may regulate, restrict, permit, determine the following: use of land, size, height, bulk, areas and dimensions. This is sounding a lot like that Model Act from 1922, isn't it? The excavation or mining of soil. Here's another section. And I think this is significant. Again, the legal basis here is the state police power, the health, safety, welfare, a la Hobbes. 15.2-2283, the purpose of zoning ordinances. Zoning ordinances shall be for the general purpose of promoting the health, safety, general welfare of the public, and further accomplishing the objectives of 15.2-2200. And here's 2200. There it is. Health, safety, welfare, convenience of welfare, and welfare to the citizens. And here's something that might be a little more modern sounding. Plan for the future development of community. Transportation systems need to be carefully planned. Adequate highway, utility, health, educational, recreational facilities. Mineral resources, agriculture. Residential areas be provided with healthy surroundings. Agricultural and forestal land be preserved. And all of those things are certainly things that our local governments do. They do it through zoning. They do it because the General Assembly has directed them to do it in this statute. And this last one's my favorite, that the growth of the community be consonant with the efficient and economical use of public funds. Sounds like sustainability to me. And really, 2200 is the legislative purpose statement, if you will, for all of Virginia's planning, zoning, and subdivision laws. And really, there have been similar statements in the code since forever. Frankly, my black book that I brought with me only goes back to 1950 because it's the code of 1950. But I understand it went back to 1922 and went back before that. And so really, I've given you citations in your materials to all the earlier versions of that code section that went back to 1950. And so really, the bottom line here on where the statutory authority comes from, land use zoning is a local government decision within the authority as set forth by the mandates of the General Assembly, which controls by statute, and under the Dillon Rule, the local governments have to do what is expressly required of them. But let me give you one example. Obviously, we've been talking in generalities about planning and zoning, and I've thrown out a couple of examples, but let me talk about one specific one. And Ms. Holt mentioned UDAs and urban development areas, and I certainly am very familiar with these. When I was county attorney and legislative liaison in Goochland, we fought against this very hard. And even after I left, I know Goochland continued to fight very hard against UDAs. But I opposed, and Goochland opposed them, I believe, for reasons other than what Ms. Holt has set forth. UDAs are certainly opposed by some as being driven by UN Agenda 21. And I will tell you that we opposed it at the time, not because of the UN, but because of it was state mandate. And we opposed state mandates on local government use. Most of you are probably familiar with these, but urban development areas were a state mandate to local governments to amend the comprehensive plan to allow and focus certain densities in certain areas. And the density was required to be sufficient to serve the expected growth, as shown in the census and shown by the various state agencies that estimated that type of growth. Now, many localities, including my own, were already applying those types of sustainable practices and principles in their zoning using existing authority. They believed in planning growth where it made sense, having traditional neighborhood types of development, having open space, mixing uses, providing room for growth. In Goochland, for example, we wanted to focus growth into our village areas and urban areas where we had water and sewer, or someday might provide water and sewer, and outside of other areas. We had a bunch of farms just like the one that Ms. Holt pointed out there, and the community was very supportive of having those areas remain more rural and not be developed in more urban patterns or suburban patterns. Now, there were a lot of flaws in that statute, many of which folks like myself pointed out to the General Assembly at the time, but they did it anyway. There are really two views on why it's flawed. One said it's too restrictive, the other said it didn't go far enough. One view, it was too restrictive. It required a one-size-fits-all minimum density. It was too high for many counties, or even some of the UDA areas. That was Goochland's approach. We just simply didn't call for that much density. But it really didn't fit the urban counties either. The size to accommodate future growth did not take into account any of the existing zoned or subdivided lots, or any of the previously existing planned growth, utilities, or roads. The statute essentially said your future growth area has to take into account future planned growth. Okay, well, what about the 10,000 lots we already have on the, subdivided and sitting on the land? The statute didn't take that into account. So the problem, one of the big flaws here, it's a state mandate. Let the locals decide. That's what we say, and we banged our fist on the table. Here's the other view. It wasn't restrictive enough. It didn't do enough to do what it's supposed to do. A UDA is supposed to focus growth, right? It's supposed to channel the growth into the urban area, right? Well, it didn't say that local governments could prohibit the growth outside the UDA. It didn't give them any additional tools to do that. It was the tools they already had. It was also applied to some localities based on size, growth, proximity to others. Didn't apply to everybody. If this is a good idea, why shouldn't everybody be doing it? And it was never truly mandatory. It was only required in the comprehensive plan, which, as the Supreme Court has held, is merely a guide. And in the end, the local governing body doesn't have to do it anyway. And so really the flaw from this view is there's really no true way to force the local governments to implement the UDAs in zoning. It was a nice idea, but it didn't go far enough. One view, too restrictive. Other view, too restrictive. Not restrictive enough, too restrictive. A little bit of a Locke and Hobbes battle, I think. So who's behind the flawed statute? I want to know. I want to get to the bottom of it. It's flawed because it's too restrictive. It's flawed because it's not restrictive enough. Well, sadly, it's not the United Nations. It's a bill in the General Assembly. And it was sponsored by Delegate Clifford Clay Athey, who's a former delegate, now judge, and Delegate Robert Bob Marshall. And this comes from the Legislative Information Services website. You can look the bills up yourself. All the numbers are in your materials. And, of course, it was sponsored on behalf of the Home Builders Association of Virginia, which obviously has a vested right in making sure as many houses get built as they can possibly build because they want to make some money on it. And this is economics. This is capitalism. I'm in favor of capitalism, okay? So I don't have any problem that was introduced on their behalf. I'm just saying it was, and that's why it was introduced. And there's some text. This is a quote from the Legislative Information website. Shows the original two patrons of House Bill 2777, Athey and Marshall, from 2007. Here's a nice picture of Ms. Holt and Delegate Marshall there. In September 2011, they met with the Shenandoah Valley Constitutional Conservatives, and they both advocated making UDAs optional, which, by the way, I agree with. I think they should be optional. House Bill 277 in that General Assembly was amended in form into House Bill 3196, which picked up two more patrons, Delegate Frederick and Delegate Rust, and then it was later on rolled into and adopted as part of the Comprehensive Transportation Bill. You may remember that there was a big promise by Governor Kane at the time to link transportation and land use. This Comprehensive Transportation Bill did a lot of things for a lot of people, but one of the things it did, it took House Bill 3196, patroned by Athey, Marshall, Frederick, and Rust, and it rolled it into word for word into House Bill 3202 that was ultimately adopted. Word for word. It also had enhanced impact fee authority. It had some other proffer provisions. It also had something that I know Delegate Marshall did not agree with. In fact, he filed a lawsuit over it, and that is the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, which had taxation authority without a local legislative vote to authorize the tax. And ultimately, the Supreme Court struck it down as a result. So this was a very big bill, 3202, but it included Delegate Marshall's bill, Athey's bill, Frederick's bill, Rust's bill, word for word. So it appears that 3202 lost Delegate Marshall's support, not because of the UDAs, because its text is identical to the thing that he agreed to patron, but likely because of the NVTA regional tax. I put in your materials all of the final patrons. They're all Republicans of 3202. You can see the folks to blame for the UDA bill and in its final form. But UDAs are now optional, thank goodness. 2012 General Assembly, Senate bill, House bill, now say it's a local option. Took a lot of shalls, made a lot of mays, and provided that. Again, I'm not saying the UDAs in concept aren't a great idea. I think they are. It basically speaks of good planning for the future. It does everything that 15.2-2200 says as far as principles of planning and zoning you need to do. I didn't like it, and I still don't like it, because it was a mandate. It basically said, local government, here's your one-size-fits-all, deal with it. But it's really not just the Republicans in the Assembly who've changed their views. There's a bunch of other conservative commentators and groups who've really distanced themselves from concerns over Agenda 21 and UDAs. In James Bacon's blog, a Bacon Rebellion, posted on January 24, 2012, James Bacon says in a misdirected attack on UDAs, he says, this opposition to the Tea Party, and I say this as a Tea Party sympathizer, arises from naive acceptance of misinformation supplied by a small group of anti-Agenda 21 zealots. He says, quote, the anti-Agenda 21 movement is a case study in paranoid style in American politics, and responsible Tea Party leaders should be well advised to entertain opposing perspectives. The Heritage Foundation, hardly an advocate of leftist social engineering, has distanced itself from the anti-Agenda 21 movement on the grounds that it is crowding out an intelligent critique of smart growth. A couple more quotes from Bacon. Quote, it is hard to see how anyone would construe UDAs as a gross violation of Virginians' property rights. Quote, time for a reality check. Quote, the law does not diminish anyone's property rights. Quote, UDA law is fiscally conservative in its inspiration, something that smart growth advocates understand. Quote, smart growth in Virginia is not about marching to the tune of the UN, it's not about social engineering, sweeping away single-family dwellings, or taking people's automobiles. Quote, smart growth movement recognizes a profound truth that the cost of government services varies in proportion to which land development is compact or sprawling. Quote, smart growthers offer a coherent set of principles for reducing the cost of government and holding down taxes. It seems, unquote, it seems to me that Tea Party sympathizer James Bacon does recognize that local government land use is about achieving that last purpose of zoning and planning that the General Assembly set local governments to do, and that is, quote, that the growth of the community be consonant with the efficient and economical use of public funds, and not about some UN agenda. Ms. Holt earlier put up a lot of code sections up there and said that they were linked to the UN. I don't know about all that, but I do know that I looked up many of these code sections in the Legislative Information Services and researched them back in the old Acts of Assembly to find how long they've been around and how long have they been amended, and could they possibly be derived from some UN mandate. One of them is an amendment that was done this year to 15.2-4200, the Regional Cooperation Act of 1995. And that gives the power to regulate, create debt, and apply directly to the federal government for grants by these regional authorities. And that's from the VA 10thamendment.org website. Really all the General Assembly did this year was they renamed the former Virginia Area Development Act that really dated back to 1962. And you can look it up yourself. If you look it up in the Black Book, you can see the legislative history at the bottom of the code section, and it will show you how far it goes back in date. Certainly you can find also the Acts of Assembly chapter numbers there as well. The second one is 10.1-1700, the Open Space Easement Act. This does allow Virginia bodies to acquire open space easements. It goes back to 1966, and I've given you the Acts of Assembly chapter number there, 461, and an earlier version of the code section, 10-156. Chapter 10.1, the Virginia Conservation Easement Act, provides incentives for the conservation of land into perpetuity. It does in fact do that. It dates back to 1988. I've given you, it's actually a private property owner option. It's not mandatory. It's usually used by folks that wish to take advantage of tax credits and save money on their taxes. And it may be mandated by the UN, I don't know, but I know there are a lot of people that really like it. And I think that if you really want individual property owners to have their rights, then they ought to have the right to be able to record easements if they wish. 10.1-563, regulation of land disturbing activities. This is a statute that actually protects our drinking water, our public waters that are used for aquatic recreation and other things from erosion. It actually goes back to 1973. I've given you the code section there. And that really, from a local government perspective, is a state mandate that local governments must comply with. 15.2-2316.2 is purchase and transfer of development rights. Did you know that the first TDR program was adopted in 1968 in New York City? In 1986, Loudoun County already had one of these programs in 1986. In fact, there was an AG's opinion, and the AG said, hey, it's not a taking, it's not a violation of due process, it's not a violation of equal protection, but you haven't got authority from the General Assembly yet, go and ask. Well, local governments asked from 1986 through 2007 when they finally got that authority. 15.2-5102, water, sewer, and refuse authorities specified as political subdivisions given powers of eminent domain in 15.2-5114. This says that one or more authorities may form water, sewer, refuse authorities to provide needed utilities. These go back at least to 1950, and perhaps further. I was able to trace it back in the time that I had available to me, back to 1950 in section 15-764.3. The 2012 amendment did clarify that it's a political subdivision, because I understand the Supreme Court had made some sort of a distinction there that was important. But significantly, these authorities have always had the powers of eminent domain. The 2012 bill only specified that Title 25.1 be used and not 33.1. So here's my conclusion, and I don't know if I'm cutting my short on time or I'm doing okay.
2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, great. Well, 2 or 3 minutes is what I need. If you don't like a land use policy ordinance that's mandated by the federal government or the General Assembly or adopted by the locality, it's because it unfairly restricts your rights or because it's unwise, say so. We've got a process for that. The General Assembly has set up a public hearing process, has required that your elected officials stand for election every 4 years, and requires for the public to take your input. So, but don't assume it's due to a UN agenda. Instead, participate in the age-old American debate over exactly where to draw the line between private property owner rights on the one hand, just like good old Mr. Locke, and the very real need for government to achieve our joint goals in the interests of all citizens, a la Mr. Hobbes. So whether you support the local land use, planning, zoning law, whatever it is that you're complaining about or like, if you want to change it or if you like it, talk to your local government officials, talk to the General Assembly, talk to some of those other agencies responsible. But it's not part of the UN agenda. Follow the example of the Heritage Foundation and James Bacon, engage in an intelligent discussion about smart growth. What it is you do, what it is you don't like about it. These are legitimate perspectives. It's a legitimate debate. It's been going on since our country was founded. And good local planners and elected officials do want to know what the community wants, and the comprehensive plan helps guide those good decisions. And the debate over proper scope of local land use, planning and zoning is what makes America great. Last 2 quotes from Mr. Locke. Government has no other end but the preservation of property, said Mr. Locke. Mr. Hobbes said that a man should be willing, when others are too, as so far as peace and defense of himself he thinks is necessary, he should be able to lay down his right to all things and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow against himself. Thank you very much for your time.
Andrew, thank you for the perspective that you just shared with us. We'll take about a 15-minute break. There's soft drinks, cookies, and such out in the foyer area, and then we'll reconvene and have an opportunity for Ms. Hobbs to comment on Andrew, and Andrew back to Ms. Hobbs, and we'll look at the questions. Thank you.
It's not Ms. Hobbs.
Block floating around. Sometimes it sticks with you, but it's Donna Holt. Donna, thank you for your remarks, and Andrew, thank you for your remarks. What we're doing next is affording each individual, Donna and then Andrew, to maybe ask a question of each other before we open it up for general comment and question from you, yeah, assuming there are questions. And if so, I'm going to ask that you stand so that the various cameras can pick you up, but also pick up that question that you want to advance to Donna and or Andrew. So Donna, I think you said you have a comment that you might like to make relative to what you heard Andrew say, and he in turn might have something that he will ask you. Thanks.
Okay, very good. First of all, you might be surprised to know, Mr. Roberts, that I really don't disagree with anything you said, with the exception.
I'm not the one who called you.
That policy is not being driven by the United Nations. What Mr. Roberts failed to tell you all is that Mr. Hawes was not a freedom-loving American. He was a communist. So going back to the beginning of time, he's correct. There's always been this battle between collectivism and freedom, or collective liberty, as he chose it. I don't think of that as liberty. But collectivism or freedom. It's an age-old conflict. And the only thing that has changed is that those who would want to bring a socialist ideology to America joined forces with environmental groups, and in 1992 delivered a new plan by a different name. It's the same plan, it's the same conflict, just new faces and a new name. That's the only thing that's changed. And I don't ask you to take my word for anything I put here. The handout that I gave you, what is sustainable development? I see Mr. Roberts did check out my website, virginia10thamendment.org. I will put the presentation that I gave you today up there, and I will give you the sources of all that information. Read it for yourself, draw your own conclusions. And that's really the only comment I have. Thank you.
Andrew, you?
Can I close this? Can I close this?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Just give me a place to rest my stuff. Donna, I think we really have more common ground than I thought we would when I came here today, and I'm pleased to say that. I do think that many of the policy perspectives that you have opposed here today and have continued to oppose are ones that many Virginia citizens would oppose, but obviously there are other Virginia citizens who disagree. And I guess my perspective and my outline, I think, says that really I think it's part of the great American debate to let's engage on these issues and let's discuss them, and let's give a sort of intellectual foundation to the debate. And let's find out exactly where to draw that line between individual rights and community values, and I think that's important. A couple of things that I did note in your presentation that I wanted to talk about. You said that you really didn't have any problem with sustainability as defined in the Brundtland Commission. It was sort of the fact that the UN had used it to have an influence on local policy. Is that correct?
Well, their idea of sustainability is a little different from what I do as sustainability.
But the definition itself is okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
It's just the meaning behind that, as far as they're concerned, from the documents I read, is very different from what that means to me.
I went through most of the purposes of zoning and planning in 15.2-2200. Is there anything in there that you disagree with?
Well, no. And in fact, much of that does go back, like you said, there have been changes and amendments to that over the years, as there are with all of these rules. And each time that there's a new amendment, it does become more restrictive. And it does demand more of local government, but more restrictions on our freedoms. But the fact that water authorities have the powers of eminent domain, that didn't come about until they were given those powers through legislation in the in the 2011 session, when they were then deemed a political subdivision and given that authority. That's when the legislation was passed to do just that, and it says that in the legislation.
Well, it was certainly true that they were labeled political subdivisions expressly, because the Supreme Court case had raised that as an issue, but they'd always had the power of eminent domain. That's been around for many, many years. One of the documents that you pointed to in your presentation, 1997, House Document Number 6, and that was, I think, part of the dots you were connecting to show how this ultimately flowed down to local governments. I mean, I've got the document, I've read through it. I don't see anything in here where it says that the General Assembly is saying we need to take any kind of action, or suggesting a bill be filed, suggesting an amendment of the budget at all. I'll just read real briefly the conclusion of it, which is where you would think that calls for action would be. The issue of sustainability is one that is complex and far-reaching, involving not only ideas about economics, the environment, social goals. Sustainable development is also concerned with the process of decision-making in both the public and private sectors. I couldn't agree more. While the task force made no formal recommendations, is that what that says in here? House Document 6? I thought this was part of the connecting the dots that meant that we were being controlled by the UN. It says here, no formal recommendations. Donna, is that true?
In this conclusion, they're not making formal recommendations, but they do have a chapter here on the strategic plan, and they talk about regional planning district commissions. And of course, the ideas are left up to those regional, they didn't get specific with strategies, and of course none of this ends up specific. Where the specifics come from is from agencies of the federal government. The Secretary of Commerce, Ron Brown, said in the 11th meeting of the President's Council on Sustainable Development that 67% of the policy recommendations could be implemented using rulemaking authority. And other department secretaries agreed with those numbers. And that's what happens when you accept the grants. It comes with strings. When you get funding from the Department of Transportation, it requires your commitment to so-called sustainable communities with the new urbanism design techniques or design. And of course, they try to link all of it to transportation. We just haven't had the funding for high-speed rail. That was originally in the plan, but we don't have that in our plan for now. It may be again in the future.
Don, I have another question. And I mean, you said you really don't disagree with the historic presentation that I made, and all of that really is the case. So I'm having a struggle. I'm a pretty logical guy. I try to be anyway, because I'm not smart enough not to be logical. And when I look at it, I say, okay, all of this legislation against nuisance and all of these Supreme Court cases that were saying it's okay that property rights are subject to sort of community safety, health things. And I view all of that sort of coming in from the 19th into the 20th century, and then model zoning codes emerge, etc., long before the UN existed, certainly long before the word sustainable. I mean, okay, and of course, planning and zoning and many of these statutes I pointed out existed long before the UN Agenda 21, even before the 1987 Commission. And so, again, I'm trying to be logical. If these sort of planning and zoning techniques existed before the UN Agenda 21, and then the UN Agenda 21 then existed, is it more likely the UN Agenda 21 affected the planning and zoning in America, in Virginia? Or is it more likely that the planning and zoning policies and practices of America have influenced Agenda 21?
I would argue that the planning of the socialist agenda, or a more socialist ideology, has entered into the United Nations and is now being sent to the United States. And that's how it's come to us. But nothing has changed, like I said. The conflict between the socialist ideology and liberty is an ongoing conflict. It was going on. We fought a revolution over it. Okay? And before the ink was dry on the Constitution, they were back at us with it. And it's been an ongoing conflict. Okay? And we became a member of the United Nations. But the United Nations they are an association of all nations, of which we are a member, and we pay dues. But they've adopted and agreed with the more socialist ideology. And they've come up with a worldwide plan that's not any different from Hobbes and what he was pushing. All they did was changed the excuse. They repackaged it. They used the environment as an excuse for collectivism, for those kinds of ideas. And that new package has made its way into policy for America.
Don, I have another question. Again, I'm a logical guy, and so I'm trying to think logically. Obviously, modern planning and zoning techniques in Virginia and America and our local governments, they use terminology like sustainable practices, green, environmental. I mean, they do. There's no question about that. And you did a very good job pointing out that those same terms were used in the UN Agenda 21. Where the logical step that I'm lacking is, where is the requirement that local governments who are acting within the Dillon Rule, as mandated by the General Assembly, do these things? Where's the mandate? Where is, in the end, the requirement that our local government planning commissions, boards, councils do this? I didn't see it in your presentation, and I've looked for it, haven't found it. Just because, I guess logically, I'm thinking just because the same terminology is used doesn't mean one's forcing the other, possibly.
No, in fact, the terminology is all the same. Nothing has changed in the terminology with regard to planning. What has changed is the ideas that go behind, the policies behind the plans. Definitions are changing. Take, for example, let's talk about the 65-10 rule. I don't remember growing up on a farm or when people had 5 acres
You have
of
to
land.
speak up a little bit.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I don't recall in previous years anything like 65-10 rule, which is being applied in many localities where 65% of the land has to remain natural and undisturbed. There have been cases where people have been fined, not in Virginia, it hasn't happened here, hopefully it won't, but there have been cases where a lady in the state of Washington was fined because right on the outer edge, in other words, what she did was she planted azaleas, rhododendrons, all of these shade-loving plants to dress up the edge of her natural area that had to be natural and undisturbed. What happened is it resulted in only about 60% being left natural and undisturbed. And they came and told her she had to return it to its natural state or be fined. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. How is this affecting someone else's property rights? How am I affecting my neighbor? If anything, I'm improving the value of that neighbor's property. Why is it that I should have to preserve 65%, set aside 65% of my land? That's more than half of my land, natural and unpreserved, or left natural and undisturbed, excuse me. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And I'm talking about free market principles. You know, I live in a walkable community right now and I love it. And there's a market for it. But things should be driven by the market. Just because you build it, the idea that you build it and they will come, it's kind of a ridiculous notion. And the idea that you're going to have mixed income communities is not a very practical notion either. Because I don't know too many people who would buy a a $3,000 square foot home in the same community or the same high-rise multi-family complex as someone who couldn't afford more than 800 square feet. And it drives up the cost of housing. In fact, there have been many studies done, as well as the Heritage Foundation, to show that smart growth, or planning for smart growth, does increase the cost of housing. They tracked it and saw that it also lends itself, or in areas with the greatest, where there are the most smart growth policies and the most restrictive regulations, do become the most expensive areas to buy. It also contributed to the housing bubble. It also contributes to foreclosures. And they noticed that the foreclosure patterns were following along with those areas that were zoned for higher density. And I have no problem with high density walkable communities. If it's market driven, if our tax dollars aren't funding it, and there's a market analysis that shows that there's a market for it.
Well, Donna, let me ask you a question about that. I mean, I certainly am glad to hear that you're living in one of these walkable communities that I guess the UDA was intended to establish.
Well, actually, it's a 50-year-old community. It's not one of the new urbanisms.
It's old urbanism, I got you. Okay. I guess the question I have is without good planning and zoning practices leading to that kind of a thing, does it just sort of erupt? I mean, the farmer that you showed there, obviously there may be no market for a walkable community on his farm, but if planning and zoning doesn't actually determine where the public facilities can go to support that kind of a thing, obviously there are many communities, including the one I live in, where we don't want a huge boatload of that density or whatnot. But at some level, doesn't there have to be planning and zoning to plan for that kind of thing?
Absolutely, and I support that. The problem is with mandates and the idea, again, that you build it and they will come. If there's a market for it, build it. If the community wants it, let them have it. I'm not against UDAs. I'm against them being mandated.
Well, then you and I agree on that.
I'm against federal funding for them. It should be developed using free market principles in a free market without federal funding, and where there's a market for it.
Well, Donna, let's get some questions from the audience here.
Yes, questions? We'll start up here with Mrs. Carolyn. Thank you. And then we'll go back to Mr. Gates. And again, please maybe stand up, those who are asking the question, because it'll be easier to hear and see. So, yes, please, so everybody can hear.
Mr. McRoberts, this question is for you. I hope you can answer this. But he said, my question is, with ever expanding restrictions and permit requirements, what exactly are we allowed to do on our property that you don't need government permission for?
You need a smarter lawyer than me to answer that question, ma'am.
And can I just make a comment?
Well, let's finish our questions, okay? This really covers some questions, all right? Mr. Gates.
Ms. Holt, I think you've done a very good job at explaining or proving the existence of Agenda 21 and even maybe some of the motivations behind the creation of Agenda 21. My concern is the link between its existence and how the everyday comprehensive planning process that's happening in our jurisdictions in Virginia relates. I know that there's many different anecdotal evidence of it happening elsewhere, but my concern is here. And I guess the way that I would say it is, how does that relate? Let's go back to your example, your hypothetical of the farmer. If the decision is made that he can't do what the developer wanted because of the local comprehensive plan, well, isn't a comprehensive plan done by a democratic process that the local residents together have worked on? And my question would be, if that's created by the locals, then who under the market should pay for him to go against what all the residents have said? Who should pay for the roads? Who should pay for the water and sewer? Who should pay for the water that's taken out of the ground that the rest of the residents agreed shouldn't be?
Well, first of all, the developer should have to pay for those things, which I agreed with. And I also said that you've also got to take into account the revenue that's coming into the area, because instead of one property owner paying taxes, if you're building 3,250 homes, you now have 3,250 property owners paying taxes. And then you're also talking about retail, which brings commerce to the area. So you're talking about those things too. And generally in the past, they have the revenues realized from that type of development does more than cover. I'm not talking about leapfrogging, and I'm not supporting leapfrogging. I think we do have to have a balance there, and I agree with that. And I do think the system needs to work at the local level, and we need to hear from the citizens. And I do believe in some way it is about the collective, because you do have to hear from the citizens. And local governments have a very tough job because they have to weigh both sides of the argument. And I agree with that. I can tell you that there are some local governments, however, that don't allow the public to speak. And there are people here who can testify to that. Chesterfield County was very good, and I thank them.
Matt?
Are you saying that you would allow the locality to raise taxes so they could pay for the development?
I would say that the developer is responsible to pay a great deal of those costs.
To the landowner or to the...
Well, for the roads.
For the schools and the extra water supply and...
Well, no, I'm talking about for the roads leading up to that. I think you get enough revenue for the roads. And if you're talking about a rural area, why couldn't they have wells? Why do they have to have water?
Okay, well...
Unless you're going to ban sewer systems, which are being done.
How does the community build schools if they can't raise the taxes for the additional people coming in?
Well, you're talking about 3,250 more homes, 3,250 families. That's if you've got growth in your community. If you're not anticipating growth in the community, then you can't expect that to happen.
My question is still, how do you pay for those amenities that the fire departments and the 1.8 kids per family living out there, the schools?
From the revenues of the additional residents.
The revenue,
you got 3,250 homes now instead of one. The revenues to the local government through property ownership.
You raise taxes.
No, you have 3,249 more people paying property tax. The value of the property goes up when you develop it. It's not going to remain the same. The value will go up, and you have 3,250 residents paying property taxes versus one.
And the suggestion
And then
is
you've
that
also got jobs that are coming.
3,250 would generate the necessary revenue to pay all the bills that Matt is suggesting that need to be paid.
Yeah.
That's not the case.
Studies have shown that in general, single-family homes do not pay for the services that they need in schools and libraries and parks and other things like that. Now, I will tell you that once the dollar price of that house goes high enough, and in some of those places that you were talking about that have the restricted land use, the prices do go high enough to support. But I will tell you that in general, a single-family home does not pay for itself in schools and water, sewer, libraries, parks, and things like that. It just doesn't.
Conservative think tanks and other extreme have also vouched for that. Home Builders Association figures also vouch for that. Commercial and industrial and business development generally is a break-even proposition. Dollars generated through agriculture, forest, law, horticulture, and open space. For every dollar generated, the resulting cost back to local services is about 20 cents on the dollar. So what pays for itself is usually open space. Next question for the group. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just-
Trudy, I need to make sure I get your
Oh,
last
yes.
name because
That's
I don't know what
exactly-
happened to you.
We'll get you. All right. I'm really curious. Very good presentation by both of you. But I'm curious to know if Mrs. Holt has actually seen evidence of any kind of move toward population reduction in this country based upon, I think it was the Global Diversity Program or Assessment.
Interesting.
Okay, hang on. Sorry, where are we on my notes? I haven't seen anything like that. Sorry. I haven't seen anything like that locally. However, I can tell you that goal number 8 in this document written by the President's Council on Sustainable Development, it does talk about population and a move towards stabilization of the U.S. population. And it says reduced rate of population growth in the United States and the world is necessary. So they do talk about that. They haven't given any clear plans. They talk about increasing educational opportunities for women. They talk about decreased number of unintended pregnancies. They talk about better access to abortions. So those are the things that they've talked about. I haven't seen anything come down at the state or local level, but this is talked about in the United States.
There's no ban, as far as I know, in terms of a population threshold not to be exceeded in the country or any state, the union, or any local government.
Right.
Next question or comment for the good of the group here? Yes, ma'am.
Mr. McRoberts, got a question. You had, were talking about the UDAs and made the comment there was no true way to force the locality to implement UDAs in their zoning ordinances. But we found out from experience locally that all localities were had an opportunity to get grants from VDOT to help them implement UDAs. Most of them, I believe, were 50,000. A couple of them might have been 300, 3.2 million or something like that.
Planning grants.
Right. And those grants required us to change our zoning.
No, ma'am. The statute never required changes in the zoning ordinance. They did require changes in the comprehensive plan.
The contract with VDOT did.
Only if your document was short.
Right.
We've got one from Town Orange, and it stopped when the consultant said they've done everything they need to do. We have chosen to move forward and look at it further, but we identified an area, we looked at it, we did all the numbers, and we sent it to VDOT, and said, thanks very much.
Yeah, I mean, so I really don't think the UDA, even before it became optional, had anything really to do with zoning directly.
Quite a few communities in Virginia already have on their books mixed-use overlay districts as a standard.
Which is great.
Exactly. Yeah, mandates, I think most of us in this room would find favor with being opposed to mandates. I think that tends to go against the grain of most of us as Virginians and as Americans. And I think that in part is a takeaway from the conversation that it's important that we be ever vigilant as to securing our property, our business, without the onerous overlay of mandates or laws or regulations that are of a confiscatory or problematic nature. So we all understand, I think, that there are limits when we think about it. It's a great question, Andrew, in terms of how far does one go with regulation for one's enjoyment of his or her own property. When we adopted the Constitution as a nation back in 1787, we established that line in the proverbial sand, the 10th Amendment, and the right of government the right of the people to create an institution called government. And they would utilize that institution at the federal, state, or local level to guide how they as individuals interact with and upon the land and relate to one another. Andrew was reading A Song of Thunder, Mr. Henry, and of course he was famous for his exhortations relative to freedoms, the pursuit of happiness and liberty. but also a champion of the rule of law. And I think that's one of the things that separates us as a nation, and we are the shining light, if you will, for the rest of the world. That we, for 200 plus years, have been successful in guiding how we do things individually and collectively as a society, governed by the rule of law. The idea of property rights is essential to who we are as American and Virginians. And Carolyn's question is very germane. But the idea that I can do with my land that which I wish to do, without regard to anyone or anything, is not a part of who we are as Americans, nor the American system of governance. Mr. Jefferson, in his Rights of Man, made crystal clear that a person can do with his land that which he wishes, to the extent that it doesn't prove injurious to his neighbor or the environment. Go back to Jamestown. I'm glad you like my writings. I do. Yeah. It was planned community. There are metes and bounds in the Old English meters saying how far the potable water supply, the drinkable water, had to be from other uses that if potable water got infected with bad stuff, it's bad for you and me. You gotta have water to live. So, your rights of your property that you own, you have not absolute rights, you have exclusive rights. You can do a lot with your property. You can tell me I'm not welcome. You can post a sign, no trespassing. You can enter into the use of that property in any manner or magnitude as long as it comports with the community standard that has been articulated and captured. Short of that, we find that we're looking at a different phenomenon. You know, the right to tax, the right of possession, the right to regulate land, all these impede upon our individual enjoyment of our land. All of us are going to leave here, and most of us came by car, and what do we have to do when we get in that car? If not immediately, soon after we turn the ignition on, we put a seatbelt on, and I hate seatbelts. I'm the best driver this side with Jimmy Johnson. When I get out on that road, I got to respect the speed limit, don't I? Okay, forget it. Next question. Yes, ma'am. Sort of gets at you were raising, Carolyn. This is a fundamental question of balance, as Donna suggests. Yes, ma'am.
Resolutions to oppose UN Agenda 21 are passing across the country and across the state. Now Alabama has passed a law prohibiting any political subdivision from adopting and developing environmental policies traceable to UN Agenda 21 that without due process infringe or restrict the private property rights of the owner of the property. The law also prohibits any political subdivision from entering into any agreement, expending any money, receiving any funds, contracting services, or giving aid to any non-governmental and or intergovernmental organization. Will the Virginia Planning Commission support this legislation for Virginia?
I don't speak for the VAPA. I'm an attorney. I work for C&C Anderson. I certainly don't think C&C Anderson is going to take a position on that. I would say, though, that there's many things in there that I, speaking personally, don't disagree with. I think that to the extent that you are taking away people's property without due process, I mean, that's unconstitutional. If there is money being spent in order to do that, then that's wrong. So I don't think I fundamentally disagree with the idea behind it. Now, whether the resolution is necessary, I don't know. One of the points of the resolution you read was that it's prohibiting things that are traceable to the UN. Well, frankly, I've been listening all day, and I think Donna's done a great job of explaining what UN Agenda 21 is to us, and that there are similar terms being used in planning and zoning in Virginia, but I haven't seen anything that's traceable to the UN Agenda 21 yet. And so I guess my question would be whether or not it's really needed. But then again, it's way above my pay grade, man. I don't believe that it's really up to the VAPA. I believe it's up to the General Assembly.
That's exactly who promulgated the legislation in Alabama. It drives home the Dillon construct. State legislature is empowered to say to the counties, cities, and towns, villages, and hamlets of Alabama what they can and can't do. The state is the ma and the pa. We're the children. Yes, ma'am.
This is to you primarily. If Agenda 21 is not being implemented, have you explained the United States report to the UN in 2002 and again in 2010 on the progress of implementing Agenda 21 in the U.S.?
Well, I'm sure that part of George H.W. Bush's signature on the line meant that they need to give reports. But just because you're giving reports doesn't mean they're actually mandating anything at the local level. The House document I read from certainly reported on sustainable efforts and reported on Agenda 21, but didn't actually mandate a thing.
So it was an empty report?
Oh, I think it was informative. I think it was helpful. I think many documents that are studied and reported by the General Assembly are helpful and interesting, but they generally don't lead to much legislation.
We have a copy of both of those reports. They
Yes.
are available online.
Okay, yes, ma'am.
I have a question about conservation easements. You mentioned those. My understanding is that these conservation easements are in perpetuity forevermore in the community. I guess, Mike, and you said this personal property rights, that should be my right to have a conservation easement. My question is, that takes it out of the tax base. So as a community, I'm kind of hurt because that land is no longer available to help fund the things in the community. So that's sort of taking away from me. And I guess,
That's a legitimate perspective.
It's kind of a backdoor.
You know, Well, what it is it's no different than if property is owned a certain way or another way. It either increases value, decreases value. That goes on all the time. The thing about the conservation easement, it's an individual property owner's choice. And as a matter of private property rights, they have the right to do that. Now, of course, the government can either encourage that or discourage that with tax credits or whatever. And Virginia's been very, very supportive of tax credits as well as the federal government. My point was that conservation easements in and of themselves are simply an exercise of private property rights. Now, if you want to have a problem with the state or the federal government supporting that through tax credits, policy question, and I think that's a legitimate debate. For example, I know that the state used to be a lot more generous with their tax credit program, and they've rolled that back in recent years.
Next question. Yes, we'll come over here and then we'll come to Sandra Roberts, I think is your name. Richard, I'm sorry.
Earlier in the presentation, there was discussion of the comprehensive plan being viewed by the public, and the public decided on how this should go forward. I live in the city of Richmond, and I've heard a lot about this being done through a consensus process. Could either of you discuss how that consensus process works?
Well, I'm not a citizen of Richmond, and I'm not really familiar with their comprehensive plan process, but I am familiar with the state statute, and it does require that it be subjected to public hearings at the planning commission level as well as the governing body level before it's adopted. And it's required to receive a recommendation from the planning commission, and it's required to be subjected to a vote, a public vote of the elected officials. And until that is, it's not a valid comprehensive plan. But I will say, as far as mandates, it is a mandate. The General Assembly has mandated comprehensive plans at the local level since, I believe, 1975.
Yes.
But does it need a consensus of the population, or is it just up to the members of the people on the panel?
Ultimately, the buck stops at the elected body.
Okay. Planning Commission makes a recommendation. They're charged with preparing and recommending a plan to the governing body. The governing body is obliged under state law to adopt a plan. Doesn't say adopt what was recommended. They're required to adopt a plan. Typically, they'll adopt what is recommended if they find favor with that plan and the policies contained therein. What has happened over the last 30, 40 years is the awareness that if we plan with people rather than trying to plan for them or assuming we know what they want, as planners we've discovered it's better to plan with people rather than plan in their name. We don't, again, take kindly to someone planning for us if we're not at that table. So a lot of planning efforts today are trying to encourage as many people to become engaged in the process as possible, so that it reflects more the interests of those who choose to be active in the plan development process. Okay, yes, Cassandra, I think you were next.
Okay, this is kind of just a comment. I would like to, I observed that
through this discussion, it seems that the principles and tenets of good planning and community development, as you've alluded to, that are decent, have been gravitated to kind of cherry-picked by different social ideologies. And what I feel like has happened is because this group who may be communist, or this group who may have socialist leanings, or this group who's classist, or this group who's a capitalist, have cherry-picked different parts and pieces of our planning tenets and principles. It almost like they get cooties. It's like, ooh, they like that, therefore I can't like that. And I have to actually do everything I can do to undermine whatever it is they're doing to try to get what's happening. And I get tired of it. Frankly, we have good, solid principles in our tools in our toolbox to grow our communities, to help them get strong. All we have to do is keep our public engaged. Remember to keep the public debate open, keep our meetings open, make sure people feel welcome, listen to them. It's planning from the ground up. You guys have talked a lot about planning from the top down, all the policies, how we're empowered, la la la. The power rests with us, the power rests with the people, and I think that the social ideologies need to stay home.
Let me completely disagree with that. When you say that you don't know who's influencing whom here, as if the Agenda 21, the Agenda 21 people and the American tradition could somehow be reconciled, how could you do that? When our tradition is individual rights, the Agenda 21 people, it's collective rights. We believe in private property. They say we need to change our attitudes on private property. And couldn't a lot of this silliness be done away with by simply offering compensation for any time society, for the benefit of society, decides to lower the value of my property by either rezoning it or determining what I can or cannot do on it, if I get compensation for that? That way.
That was the question that was put to the United States Supreme Court in the Euclid case. And the question was, local government, you have now zoned and therefore either increased or decreased value of property. And is that a taking if you've decreased the value of the property? The United States Supreme Court said that is not a taking. That is not, as long as it's a regulatory matter and it doesn't go too far. And we had to wait about 60 or 70 years to find out exactly what that meant. But in the Lucas case out of South Carolina, we found that in fact, when you pass an environmental regulation that prohibits essentially all the development on the property, then that is in fact a taking, and that is too far.
And maybe you'll tell us how that case came out. What
landowner won.
And what did the South Carolina government do after that?
Bought the land and then turned it around and sold it for development.
Then rezoned it
To
and sold it for development.
recoup their loss.
I will tell you that as far as getting compensation from the government when there's zoning or some other regulatory matter that decreases the value of your property, I will say that I've seen them many times over the years that there are many regulatory actions that do exactly that. But there are many others that increase value many-fold. And I guess my question is, if we're talking fundamental logical consistency, if government owes you money when they regulate to decrease your value, do you, sir, owe the government money when they rezone to increase the value of your land?
No, because we created them, they didn't create us.
That's a fair answer, sir, but I thought it was a fair question.
Well, last thing, you mentioned that the General Assembly in the Virginia Constitution pretty much gave itself powers to do anything they please.
That's the Virginia Supreme Court's language, not mine.
Tell me what the first article of that Constitution is.
Article 1?
Yeah, what is it?
It's Article 1.
Okay, that's cute, but it doesn't.
Why don't you answer the question, sir? You obviously know the answer.
It's the Bill of Rights, correct? Is there anything that the General Assembly can do that trumps Article 1?
No, sir. No, sir.
Correct. So what we're talking about here is the General Assembly can do anything they want in the context of a system in which rights are recognized and permanent.
I agree and 100% with that. Thank you, sir.
Settled law on that point, no question. There's settled law on that point. We might not like the settled law, but it's settled law. Yes, sir.
Is the Commonwealth the state or is the Commonwealth the people?
We the people.
We're one of 4 states known as a Commonwealth. What does that mean?
Are we the people, or is the modified state?
Well, ultimately, the people vote for the legislature. The legislature is the one with all the power.
We purposely employed the term commonweal, W-E-A-L, and that as Virginians, through the Virginia Constitution, said that we established this institution of government for the common well-being of its inhabitants. And to that end, we will advance the public health, safety, welfare of said residents of the Commonwealth of Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, likewise. So we are a little different as compared to Maryland and North Carolina. And in one sense, there is an obligation on the Commonwealth to do well by its citizens. And some contend the Commonwealth of late hasn't been doing well by its citizens.
But when people said, these are our rights, and we're going to establish a government to protect those rights.
That's right.
Now, is the United Nations protecting our rights?
No, sir.
Is the federal government protecting our rights?
The federal government is the supreme law of the land by way of the Constitution. When we set that up, we established by the addition of the first 10 amendments the standard, the parameters that would guide self-government.
Right, but have they gone outside of the parameters? They're supreme in the area that's been delegated to them, but they're not supreme. I didn't know they had all this power to tell you about zoning down here. I thought that was outside the purview of the federal government. That's a state matter.
That is.
It is a state matter.
It is state
That's
matter.
what the federal government's butting in for. What's the United Nations butting in the United States for? If it's not to decrease the constitutionally protected God-given rights of the citizens. And that's where I think the threat is, whatever you name it, whether it's Agenda 21, whether it's the U.S. Supreme Court, whether it's...
Well, I think we've all agreed that mandates are the issue, and I would agree with you.
But our Declaration of Independence says, "We the people of the United States of America." So if we do not like what our government, local or federal, is doing, then we personally need to stand up and let those people know.
I think it goes back to what Andrew said, really. That's exactly what we're supposed to do. If we find disfavor with those that we have entrusted to attend to our public health, safety, welfare needs, then we fire them. And if we find that the institutions that they're utilizing do not comport with what we think is fair and just, then we change those institutions. Constitution, when was it adopted? 225 years ago, this coming September. Have we thrown it out? We've tweaked it 17 times. Pretty good record.
What did we tweak 17 times?
U.S. Constitution.
The 17th Amendment decided to direct election of senators. That was passed back in the early 1900s.
We have 27 amendments to the U.S. Constitution.
Okay.
We've tweaked it 17 times since we adopted the Constitution with the Bill of Rights attached.
The Bill of Rights was not attached initially.
Pardon me?
The Bill of Rights was not attached
No,
initially.
I know that, but it was ultimately attached because that was what allowed the states or colonies to approve it. That was the necessity of both Virginia and Massachusetts for that to be present. That's viewed as the first 10 amendments. The Bill of Rights is also referred to as the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution. Subsequent to that, we've added 17 more over 225 years. Because we've had to make modifications in how we as a people function and live in harmony with one another. Next question, if there is one. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. McGrath, you gave a great history lesson. I learned a lot from those slides. And to me, it described the construct of something like an automobile, something very powerful, lots of parts. They all work together in harmony. They've been tinkered with over the years. And it's a powerful tool. So the issue is, I have no disagreement with any of the planning documentation, the reason for it. Typhoid Mary made a big impact on people there in the early days, and so health issues are certainly a big one. So the issue is not the rules and why we need them. The issue is with the car. Who's driving the car? Who do we give the keys to? The laws are there. What happens is when we put that person in the car, the local person, the politician, or perhaps some of you planners in there, and you say, oh, I've got this wonderful tool. It's all powerful. I know a lot. I went to planning school, got a degree in it or whatever. and I'm going to construct a cure for something that I see. So that's the issue. And in Albemarle County, we have an ongoing program which connects the dots a little bit, for you perhaps more than others, between where does Agenda 21, ICLEI and all come into the county. And Don had mentioned it comes through federal funding. The local planning district there got $1 million, shy of $1, to spend 3 years and $999,000 to conduct a livability survey. What would make the county more livable? For surveys.
And you oppose livability?
Well, you have to know what it is and who's defining it. That's the whole project. So the point being is that one of the survey results so far was, of many, one on transportation, that given freedom of choice, most people that answered the survey would rather live in the rural areas than the urban area. To which one of the planning commissioners said, or staff said, in the local press, it is too easy to build in the rural areas. This is a thorn in our flesh. So when the staff takes a position like that, they are reflecting their views and not the views of the public, and that's where the problem is.
Well, certainly, ultimately, that staff's position has to be heard by the Planning Commission, which is appointed by the governing body, and then ultimately voted upon by the elected officials. I don't know any planners that get to decide wholeheartedly which chunks of the land get to be developed or not, or at what densities. That's a political decision. It's a legislative one.
It guides their recommendations, though, through the whole process. It's a mindset which then is up to the public to fight, or perhaps not be able to counter at the
And
final
my presentation was very clear that I'm encouraging public debate.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
We have to be ever vigilant. Another comment or question? If not, then I think what we'll do is, if there's a comment from Donna or Andrew in terms of this discourse, if not, we'll go to the concluding kind of remarks that I think you were prepared, and Andrew likewise, and then we will bring closure to our time together. So again, thank you very much. Great question.
Back up again.
Yeah. Yeah, where's the...
In closing, I'd like to say, again, that I'm not opposed to zoning, not opposed to planning. I'm very much in support of environmental protection. I want clean air, I want clean water. But it's environmental extremism that destroys property values, invades our property rights, and destroys capitalism that I'm concerned with. And in closing, I'll just leave a 4.5 minute video for you to consider some of the things I've spoken about today. Thank you.
If I wanted America to fail, to follow, not lead, to suffer, not prosper, to despair, not dream, I'd start with energy. I'd cut off America.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. Sorry? No, sorry.
Yeah.
Plug in completely there.
Is that one? Plug it in.
That's mine.
Oh, I have no idea.
Wrong. It's like two terminals. It has.
Is there a teenager in the room?
There are two terminals, the right one. Yeah, it was wrong terminal. It was computer one, not computer two.
If I wanted America to fail, to follow, not lead, to suffer, not prosper, to despair, not dream, I'd start with energy. I'd cut off America's supply of cheap, abundant energy. I couldn't take it by force. So I'd make Americans feel guilty about using the energy that heats their homes, fuels their cars, runs their businesses, and powers their economy. I'd make cheap energy expensive, so that expensive energy would seem cheap. I would empower unelected bureaucrats to all but outlaw America's most abundant sources of energy. After banning its use in America, I'd make it illegal for American companies to ship it overseas. If I wanted America to fail, I'd use their schools to teach one generation of Americans that their factories and their cars will cause a new ice age. And I'd muster a straight face so I could teach the next generation that they're causing global warming. When it's cold out, I'd call it climate change instead. I'd imply that America's cities and factories would run on wind power and wishes. I'd teach children how to ignore the hypocrisy of condemning logging, mining, and farming while having roofs over their heads, heat in their homes, and food on their tables. I would never teach children that the free market is the only force in human history to uplift the poor, establish the middle class, and create lasting prosperity. Instead, I demonize prosperity itself so they will not miss what they will never have. If I wanted America to fail, I would create countless new regulations and seldom cancel old ones that would be so complicated that only bureaucrats, lawyers, and lobbyists could understand them. That way small businesses with big ideas wouldn't stand a chance. And I would never have to worry about another Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, or Steve Jobs. I would ridicule as flat earthers those who urge them to lower energy costs by increasing supply. And when the evangelists of common sense try to remind people about the laws of supply and demand, I enlist a sympathetic media to drown them out. If I wanted America to fail, I would empower unaccountable bureaucracy seated in a distant capital to bully Americans out of their dreams and their property rights. I'd send federal agents to raid guitar factories for using the wrong kind of wood. I'd force homeowners to tear down their own homes built on their own land. I'd make it almost impossible for farmers to farm, miners to mine, loggers to log, and builders to build. Because I don't believe in free markets, I'd invent false ones. I'd devise fictitious products like carbon credits and trade them in imaginary markets. I'd convince people that this would create jobs and be good for the economy. If I wanted America to fail, for every concern I'd invent a crisis, and for every crisis I'd invent a cause, like shutting down entire industries and killing tens of thousands of jobs in the name of saving spotted owls. And let everyone learn the stunning irony that the owls were victims of their larger cousins and not people, it would already be decades too late. If I wanted America to fail, I'd make it easier to stop commerce than to start it, easier to kill jobs than create them, more fashionable to resent success than to seek it. When industries seek to create jobs, I'd file lawsuits to stop them, and then I'd make taxpayers pay for my lawyers. If I wanted America to fail, I would transform the environmental agenda from a document of conservation to an economic suicide pact. I would concede entire industries to our economic rivals by imposing regulations that cost trillions. I would celebrate those who preach environmental austerity in public while indulging a lavish lifestyle in private. I convince Americans that Europe has it right and that America has it wrong. If I wanted America to fail, I would prey on the goodness and the decency of ordinary Americans. I would only need to convince them that all of this is for the greater good. If I wanted America to fail, I suppose I wouldn't change a thing.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've been here a long time. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you for listening. I really don't know what to say about that video, but I would say that I've been in land use and zoning work a very long time. I've made a major practice of that in my practice of law and as a citizen and as a community member. I do believe that the key here, and I think the takeaway, if you will, Mike, is really the fact that it is an issue of balance. I think Donna would agree with me that the issue is balance between zoning and planning and its proper purposes with public input and debate. And I will say this is a great country. This is a great country where you can actually go into a local government meeting or planning commission meeting or council or board meeting and be heard. Many countries in the world, that's not the case. And I've seen many, many times as county attorney and as a citizen where just the right words from the right groups of people have made a big difference. When folks come in and make it clear that they really like something or really don't, then the governing body is there to listen to you. Now, I'm not saying they listen to you all the time. You know, this is America, not utopia. And there are people with different views than yours. But I do believe that America is great because the debate that we have, and the right that we have to debate, and the right to be heard. And that's a very significant thing. And so, again, I would conclude by saying that if you don't like where that line is being drawn between the rights of the individual versus the rights of the community, then we have a process to change that. And I would encourage you to participate in that process because I believe in it. Thank you very much for listening to me today.
Donna, Andrew, for giving them their time and providing us with, I think, what is a very profound frame of reference as we go forth and continue on our individual lives, but also choose to be engaged and active in our communities. And I think the notion of balance is central to this equation and discourse, and hopefully the time spent this afternoon has been of value for you, and we appreciate each of you being present today. If you'd be kind enough to complete the evaluation, leave it on the table in this room or out on the table where you registered this morning or afternoon. We would appreciate that. And safe travels back home for everyone. And then on with the speed limit and all the regulations. For your own good.